Good morning, everybody. My name is Dan, the Jazz Shepherd. I want to wish everybody a happy holidays. I want to thank everybody for their support over this past year. It's been a great time to grow this community. I've met and talked to so many interesting people. It's been necessary support and interaction for me. Having been locked down in this house for 8 months, talking to y'all has kept me very sane. It's kept me safe. I need to express and interact. It's part of my personality. I need to have an audience, as it were. I chose to be a musician and a DJ for a reason. So it's been great having that interaction. It's kept me grounded. You know, if I had no outlet and no creative process going this whole time, it would have been a much tougher time. I want to thank everyone for their comments on the last couple episodes on Blue Note, where I was just asking how long everybody had been watching. It gave me some clarity. For the most part, most people said they weren't concerned about when I repeat things. It helps them remember it themselves. It's hard not when you're cross-referencing the jazz universe to cross certain star systems a lot. And I think it's always important to have some frame of reference. And then one of the things I want to dive into today is the art of emoting and improvisation and how linked those two things are. And part of what I want to tie together here is I get questions, and they're most often from European or Asian viewers asking me to explain some of the social setting because they don't really relate to it. They don't see it firsthand. And everybody knows slavery was an institution in this country long after it was banned everywhere else. An interesting tidbit is there was a landmark court case in England in 1775 where a slave was petitioning the courts for his independence from his master, and this case was landmark because it was going to affect the entire British Empire, of which America and Canada were still very much a part of. And in a clever stroke, the British court struck down slavery across the British Empire. And it's pretty clear to me that it wasn't just idealistic. They knew that all these up-and-coming colonies were relying on slave labor for a lot of their economic resources, for a lot of their labor, you know. And you would cripple and handicap greatly American individualism and motivation to separate if you took away their free labor. It would limit their ability to industrialize and to compete and to ascend in the global economy and essentially keep them subservient beneath the British. It had the opposite effect because there was a lot of American business interests that weren't about to have that labor source taken from them. And there's a viewpoint out there that states the Revolutionary War was as much about maintaining slavery for economic reasons as it was independence from British taxation. We've always been told it was about British rule of thumb, but this was one of the real pieces of legislation that was coming down and had a huge economic impact on the outcome of the American colonies. So much of this nation has been shaped around slavery and that great crime of history. Genocide of the Native Americans here shows just how ruthless the mindset of these people were. Slavery was a step above death. Not maybe the best step above death, but it's a step above death. We wiped the Native Americans out. The numbers are saying 75 to 100 million Native Americans from South America to North America were wiped out, many by disease, of course, from lack of immunity, but a lot of that was done with some intention. So there's a ruthlessness that's illustrated in that allows you to realize how slavery was nonchalant business at hand. And it was cattle. It was an economic enterprise. And slavery continues on in America for another almost century. And of course, the Second Great War in America, the Civil War, was fought in not just about slavery. You know, but it certainly was the well publicized part of the conflict. And it wasn't like the end of slavery at the end of the Civil War ended the inequality between black and white America. Uh, the blacks were concentrated heavily in the South. And if you see the population charts, there's a lot of counties in the southern states that were more black than white. So there was a fear in the South of retribution, of being a minority as a white, powerful male with a gun. But still, the uprising of your slave population was a terrifying thought. And it was even more terrifying in light of having 3 or 4 daughters, because that mortified you. You know, I mean, you were afraid of that sexually liberal black male, and that still exists today, and I've talked about that before. But so there's a era of Reconstruction in the South, and then Jim Crow, where, for all intents and purposes, many of the facets of slavery continued. And whether it was through prison population chain gangs or working at the company store, there was systems in place that kept most blacks still very much an oppressed economic entity. And there's 2 different forms of racism. There's economic racism that's justified and driven by economics. And then there's the emotional, personal racism of hate that wants to burn someone of a different race or kill them. And the economic racism doesn't want to burn its livestock. That's a different mentality than the hate that burns in some Americans. And when you study that and try to comprehend it, and as a DJ in the black community, I was surprised how the general consensus among the hundreds and hundreds, if not thousands, of blacks I got to know really well wasn't one of resentment and hate and anger and fury. It was one of much more forgiveness, the Louis Armstrong mentality, one of we just got to put that in the past and move forward. There was not a lot of angry black vitriolic, I want to go out and kill every white guy. And maybe they didn't tell me because I'm a white guy, but honestly, it just wasn't in any of their emotional forecasts. You just didn't see that element in 99% of them. Race was something they actually wanted to talk about less and not focus on and keep the divide as powerful as it is. And in white America, there's a strong proponent of hate and animosity and incredible acts of violence against blacks, which is kind of counterintuitive because you would think that the acts of great hatred would come from the oppressed group striking and rising back. But you don't really hear very many cases of a group of blacks dragging a white guy behind a pickup truck to his death, taking a white guy, lynching him, and burning his body. You just don't read those stories. You do read, sadly, many times throughout history where white crowds and mobs have done things that are unimaginable, from the Tulsa riots in 1921 to what happened throughout the North during the Great Migration, to the Industrial Age and the work and the strikes and the blacks trying to find their place within this new economics that were presented by a lot of white lower class people as competitors for their jobs. So there was a lot of unrest even post the abolition, and it just festers. And the blacks were segregated by the banks, by politics, by hate, fear, and poverty into certain pockets within the big American cities. And this contributed to the white flight of white Americans out of those cities, and those cities falling into great inner city poverties. Services diminish, police diminish, schooling, all the essentials of what make living in a great city valuable, as resources get cut to the city itself by the tax base because all your rich people are leaving. It's just harder to fund a police department to patrol streets that are full of crime. You need more cops and there's less money to do it. And on top of that, the cops end up started becoming seen as a non-trusted entity. So there's a lot of black on black policing. If you rob from me and I don't feel like I can call the cops, my retribution is my own judgment and my own execution of that judgment. And so a lot of that gets misconstrued in the media as just black on black crime and black on black violence, but a lot of it's black on black policing. And you see that when you get closer to the community. But it's actually not the Wild West of American whites, history of that type of judgment and justice. It's far more one of a community exiled kind of. It's tough to explain, but as we moved into the 60s and the riots that happened in that era and the post-war promises of freedom being still denied, there's a white America that's moved out of the city into the suburbs and the rural areas. And the rural Americans always existed. They were a strong part of the country's population for most of its history. And so that rural white America and even suburban white America lives very isolated from those pockets of blacks. And what it leads to is a lot of white people not interacting with black people hardly ever. And I don't know a black person who doesn't have white friends, a white boss, a white manager, 3 friends that are white as co-workers, white students, white. It's just play basketball with white guys. Black people all are immersed in white America. There's very few people, no matter how black their neighborhood is, that don't have to interact with white people every day at work and at school and just in different interactions in life. There's a lot of white Americans who never interact with black Americans. And I would say for half of white America, most of their impression of black America is shaped by the one black person that they might know who lives in town, who's usually become kind of suburbanized and is often a positive example of what the black community looks like. And so you actually hear white Americans say things, I don't really trust black people, but I like Micah. He's a good guy. But like they're surprised that he's decent. And in complimenting him, they're kind of backstabbing the entire black community by saying what they're saying. Like, he's okay. I trust him. It's so subliminal. But on top of them only knowing 0 or 1 or 2 black people, maybe a black family, and those who move to the suburbs as blacks are upwardly mobile, financially more capable of interacting with white communities because of their financial status. Black people in America don't move to Eden Prairie unless they have money. So the poor blacks all stay in those inner city pockets. So there's a certain element of black America in white America, but it's a small sliver of that white suburban, white rural experience. Conversely, the media is portraying a black America that's terrifying. And this is by design. In spite of us trying to stitch together the fabric of black and white in America, which many on both sides want to be the case. I would go so far as to say 95% of the black community wants there to be harmony and peace with the white community. And I would say it's 75-80% of the white community wants there to be peace and harmony with the black community. Even these good people out here in small town white America, most of them aren't filled with the racial hatred. If anything, it's a fear from not knowing each other, not having any personal experience with it. But they're often so manipulated by the media's image of things. And they're often forced to have to pick a side to the point where the polarization will continue. And so the Black Lives Matter thing with the Blue Lives Matter thing here in America, cops versus the blacks. The average white American here in rural white America, or even suburban America, who hardly knows black people, and through all the images they see on the TV, they're afraid of black people. When they are forced to choose between, do I support the blacks, who I don't really hate, but I don't trust, Or do I support the cops, who, if I need, will protect me from the black people? So they support the cops. And it's not wrong in supporting your police, but you don't have to choose one or the other. But they put us in a place where we feel obligated to have to choose. And so for you people in Europe who don't know the context of what I'm talking about, in the average American town, you drive through nowadays, and there will be a half dozen, 24 yard signs saying, Blue Lives Matter. And there'll be also some yard signs saying Black Lives Matter. When in reality, all lives matter. And the Black Lives Matter started as a good ideology, but it's become so politicized and so used to divide just as much as the Blue Lives Matter is meant to divide. And the conservative community gets outraged by, why do just Black Lives Matter? They're shooting the police. And then the liberal community says, how can you say Black lives don't matter? And so instead of us finding a unity, we're actually still polarized by our outrage and these silly stickers on the yard signs. You don't have to choose black or blue, but we're being forced into thinking that we do. And why? It's simple as to why. The most scary thing to the status quo would be for the entirety of society to find unity and thus share common interests. And the crazy thing is that we actually do share common interests even now. But because of the polarization and the fear and the divide, we will set aside those common interests over and in place of the fact I need to feel safe. And they use the same thing to arm the armed forces for decades, fear. That's how we got to keep funneling trillions of dollars into defense so you ain't scared. I'd love healthcare. I'd love a better school system, but please keep me safe. Empires throughout history have done this. If you're naive enough to think that we're not, you live in a bubble. And that's part of the issue with what's happened in America. Our media has become so much more a perception of reality than reality itself, that it dictates and shapes all of our policy and all of our thinking. And so we're still so divided because of an economic agenda to keep us divided, that the few people who really do foment hate are so publicized by that incidence of hate, and they actually find ears to listen to what they say because of the fear and the discourse. And so a small 1-3-5% of the population who really doesn't want to live in peace with the other side actually becomes far more powerful because the media amplifies their message. And every time they can put on something on the TV that they can polarize that news story and foment fury and outrage in both sides of the camp. If they can walk away from a news story with somehow the Republicans mad as hell about one part of this and the liberals mad as fuck about the other part and the injustice, that outrage furthers the divide. And the status quo will remain. Nothing can change when we're so divided. And even the U.S. Congress, everything is so carefully chosen in our daily news stories that it keeps the American population right at this 50-50 balance. And if the one side starts to creep, they find a really powerful topic or subject that can really amplify and help grow the numbers on the other side again, so that they can keep this kind of balance where change is impossible. The polarity has become so strong and so divisive, and you're so unable to cross party lines, that this partisanship has created a stalemate where what is existing now will continue to exist until we can see and think differently. So much of the racism in America today is artificially created and stimulated by the economic powers that be that need us to stay living in fear. And so if they can make it seem like if you go into Chicago or Milwaukee, you're lucky to get shot as a bystander and some cop and some black guy shoot each other. And that will actually keep you isolated and prevent you from going to those cities where that diversity exists, so that your broadness of mind and opinion of diversity would change and shift. There's nothing more liberal in America than a New Yorker, because every walk of life that is and will ever be lives in those streets of that city. And so it creates a complacency to difference, and everything becomes normal and acceptable, and there's no need to be afraid of what I'm comfortable with. And so we're kept apart and divided so artificially. And even our television shows are designed to emphasize this fear, and there's little things put in them that if your mind is open and perceptive to, you can see the propaganda. And it's economic. It's not political per se. It's not really racially charged. It's not really religiously motivated. It's about economics and maintaining control and not allowing policy to shift, because the population of our nation now agrees that 90% of us say we want health care, period. That would force change. So you got to keep abortion on the burner and cooking and stirring. You got to keep race so fomented that everyone's so on edge all the time. You got to make the police look like they're under attack so we can keep funding them, putting billions of dollars into police departments to turn them into military units. And we see this as growth. We see this as freedom. And what we've actually created is a society that's less free than most. And so the blacks are constantly a victim of a history that's awful, that they kind of want to put behind them. But it's so regurgitated in the daily headlines every day that the average rural white American who doesn't know a black person, their first instinct is to be afraid of said black person. And they will cross the street if they're walking and shopping somewhere and they see it's fear. It's fear of what you don't know and what you're not comfortable with. And the same thing goes for sexuality. If you live next to Muslims, after a while you won't fear them. If you live next to gay people, after a while you'll be having drinks with them. You know what I mean? If you live next to a group of black people, you'll eventually be playing cards with them and having a good time. Because people are people. We all just want our kids home safe at night, food in our kids' stomachs. Is my laundry done? I don't got time before I go to bed to hate a nation across the ocean, a religion on a different continent, or someone who decides to pray or have sex a different way than I do. As John Lennon said, whatever gets you through the night. See what I'm saying? Whatever gets you through the night. And then I looked at some of the numbers. And when you look at the prison populations in America, blacks represent 11, 12% of the American population, 13%, and over the last century. And they often represent 40, 50% of the prison population, which is an incredible inequality. There's such an injustice. The American prison population is the highest in the world. We've turned it into a business for profit. We've privatized prisons. So there's entire industries out there that are making billions of dollars on incarcerating human beings. So for those of you in Europe who aren't familiar with some of these things, blacks are definitely the target of these prison programs. It's one way to keep that breeding population down. And there's a reason why the black male is the target of so much. There's a target on their backs. You know, it's clear that their life expectancy in this country is much shorter than those of white Americans. That's shocking. You want to know what racism looks like? The fact that this black male is expected to live 7 to 10 years a shorter time frame and spend much more of his life behind bars. Those numbers are awfully revelatory. I have a lot to say about how it still is for black Americans today. The southern communities have high black prison populations. They still often use them as chain gangs in Alabama, if I were correct, maybe Georgia. They might have changed that recently, I can't recall, but pretty recently they still had prison chain gangs out doing labor, and they might still. I think Alabama still does. That's still a form of slavery. If I incarcerate you for next to nothing, and make you serve 6 years for something, and then put you to work for free for all those, that's slavery. And the amount of fabricated charges against black youth in this country, whether they be of a sexual nature, and a gal wants to hang out with Tyrone, and then she feels guilty about what happened with Tyrone the next day, or her daddy might find out, and suddenly Tyrone forced herself on me. That story is really prevalent in America. You know, there's a lot of black youth in jail because you approached someone's white daughter, and I got money and power, and you're going to jail, motherfucker. And there's been a lot of false accusations. College football athletes, you know, spending time in prison because of falsely being accused. So there's still such a target on their back. The chances of them being arrested any day, being shot any day. It's some of the times the blacks have been shot by the police for next to nothing, sleeping in their bed at night under false information. Breonna Taylor, they still live on an edge. They still live on an edge, and so they feel so vulnerable, and there's such a tension and a stress that it's such a part of their daily walk. And white America doesn't see it or know it. And so many of them deny white privilege and don't have any idea what it's like to walk into a supermarket and have eyes on you. Being in the mall, having eyes on you. Just being there. You might have a pocket full of money. You just got paid. But they're still looking at you like, watch these three black kids. I worked for a boss who used to say those very words. And he was old school. He was an old school Serbian who came over in the 20s. And they were actually part of Prohibition, running booze out of Canada. And they had no bones about saying openly racist things. They walked around the liquor store with pistols in their pockets. You know, it was a pretty... America's a crazy place. And then you put the guns on top of it that are so unregulated, and you can't even attempt to regulate it. No matter how much sanity you approach gun regulation, these people lose their fucking minds because the NRA is so well funded to prevent any form of regulation from affecting their profits. You know you have a volatile industry when you have an entire PR agency out there fighting to make sure that there's never anyone going to come to their senses and say, wait a second, maybe people with assault rifles isn't the best idea. Maybe we should not sell those. And they lose their minds. And it's all driven by money and greed. It's all driven by insanity. And greed is the soup du jour. It's what capitalism in America stands on. And so, again, when you put this in the context of the 50s and the 60s and when these great jazz men came up, the things they experienced and the lack of tolerance, the fear white America lived in the 20th century, it was very real. It wasn't like white people pretend to be afraid. They really are afraid. And it's not because of what black people have done or are saying. It's because of what the elites media is reminding them and telling them. And if I had to remind you what we did to the blacks, just to make you scared of them going, well, they might be coming for me, I'll even indict my own self. Or at least my 2 generations before self. I'll remind you what we did to them 1,500 years ago just to keep you afraid of them today. Because we haven't given them any justice yet. And I can't tell you how many times I've seen a story in the news and watched how they illustrated it in such a clever way that it really was designed to make someone walk away from this going, there's no justice. And I'm going to take justice into my own hands. And God forbid you have a protest because there's people just waiting to come in there and shoot those things up to create more tension and more fear. fear is a part of how empires operate. It always has been and always will be. And so, for all you Europeans, and I'm sure a lot of you know, but I do get questions. I got a question yesterday in my messages, and I was on Patreon actually, and I just wanted to touch on it. It was something I meant to touch on anyway. Looking at prison populations the other day, some of the statistics, and I think I'm going to put a few graphs in here for you. It's numbing when you see the injustice still today. How much longer their sentences are. And then as civil rights progressed in the 60s, it's almost synonymous with the war on drugs here. And we dumped this resource into a lot of poor neighborhoods, knowing that enterprising young black youth who are brilliant businessmen, just like anybody else, when they see a business opportunity, they know what to do. And they've arrested such a high percentage of blacks on drug charges over the last 50 years. And you have people sitting in jail for lifetimes for minuscule crimes. And if I'm providing heroin to a bunch of your white kids, it's the white kids who wanted who are the problem, not me as the street provider who got it from a rich white businessman who brought it into I didn't ship it in here from Afghanistan. I didn't go to Thailand and bring this stuff over. Someone with a lot more money and capital than me shipped a container ship of this shit over here to me here in Baltimore in the port. So as a black kid on the street selling it to some white kids, I'm just a middleman at best. And yet I'm the one who's going to serve the time because they needed to keep that population in check. And the last thing I want to mention here is there's a white fear of black sexuality. And it's not just about the stereotypes of penis size. That's not what this is about. That plays a part. But what it's really about is the conservative, white, Anglo-Saxon male has had his sexuality repressed his entire life. As a childhood, he spent his whole time being ashamed of his nudity, unable to touch himself, uncomfortable with sex and discussing it. The manifestations of sexual repression are serial killing, raping, molestation, abuse, self-harm, suicide. There's such a horrible mark that the repression of sexuality breeds in the white male. And places that have the most repression often have the most damaged population. If I told you couldn't take a poop because it's a sin, and you had to kind of sneak around pooping and creating almost fantasies in your mind or fetishes in your mind in order to operate and function and to poop, it would create a lot of deviation in the whole kingdom of poop. Sex is this natural, healthy thing. It's a natural source of freedom and joy. And the suppression of it is a form of control. By the church, by the commercial estate, I'll keep you consuming and buying shit. If you're content, you won't be shopping. But if you have a big emptiness in you, shopping is what we want you to fill it with. Just like the church wanted you to fill that emptiness with their dogma. And by the way, give us some money, pay for your sins, we'll take your house and your donkeys, thank you very much. So control of sexuality has been around for a long time. But here in white America, sexuality is very controlled and very regulated. And there's plenty of liberated white males. But from my experience and from my perspective, and I've talked with white people, psychiatrists, and I've talked with many black people about this, there's a connection between those racists full of hate who want to burn someone and a sexually impotent white male. And that impotence makes you feel emasculated in the presence of a virile black male, and you see them as a threat. And again, that's where that one sense of the potent black male, that stereotype, only heightens that emasculation. I know I can't get aroused to satisfy my wife I'm sitting here having a drink with her, and this big brother walks in. And he might not even have eyes for my wife. But I saw her glance at him, and now I feel impotent. I feel infantilely small. And a fury and a rage grows in these people, and it foments over time and becomes stronger and stronger. And I'm convinced most every act of real hatred by a white male against a black male has been driven by sexual jealousy, impotence, emasculation, fear of them impregnating my wife and me having a black bastard child. This is real. This is really what's happening. And the potent white male doesn't feel threatened by the black male. And as a DJ in the bar, I've seen this stuff firsthand. How confident black males are coming into the club at 12:45, 1:15, putting the fishing rod out there and reeling in a few gals. It's easy for them to hunt. They have a comfortable experience with their sexuality. There's not near the repression in the black community. Part of that's due to history. Part of that's due to so many black fathers and boyfriends being dead or in jail that most black women have multiple partners during their kids' lives. And so black children grow up seeing their mom have multiple partners. And so it doesn't seem like it's a sin or abnormal. It just seems like more of an open sexuality out of needs to survive, to keep us alive. And you weren't going to begrudge your mom from having some pleasure if her husband was in jail for the next 25 years. So the average black youth grows up seeing sex with different partners very differently than whites do. And that confidence, that openness allows them to come into a bar with great confidence, and there's no hesitation, there's no insecurity. I have a big set of antlers and I'm here just to hunt. And I'm not going to take your doe from you. There's plenty of does out there. You know, that's not how they stand. No, I'm going to go find your wife. That's not how they look. Your wife might go find them, and they'll often be happy to lend a hand, as it were, an appendage anyway. But there's a fear of the black male sexually in a lot of white Americans. And that's why you fear them moving into your neighborhood. You're not really worried about them stealing your car. You're worried about them conquering your sexual property. And it's that and that only that can explain the hatred a lot of white males have for black males. Because there's only really two things that you kill for, especially as a male. You know, it's sex and money. That's what drives every crime. You know, you go to ask any detective, any judge, you know, look at the average prison population, you're all in there because either you fucks with somebody's money or you fuck somebody that you shouldn't have. You know what I mean? That's it. Sex and money is what drives and motivates males. And white males aren't jealous of black money. We're not jealous of that pocketbook and their car, their Cadillac, and I got nicer cars than you for the most part. You know, very rarely does a white male begrudge a black male's financial standing. And that's to be understood. But the freedom of the black male sexually, they're jealous of it, they're envious of it, they're threatened by it, they live in fear of it. And that's what creates the real cases of hatred that are undescribable and unexplainable. And this is the only way I've been able to reason and make it understand it. How the white male can be, I'm going to leave my home at 11:30 on a Wednesday. I'm comfortable here, but I got 6 beers in me. But I'm going to go find me an N-word and kill him. How does that happen? Why? What? And it's that sexual emasculation. And emasculation, we all know sexual emasculation is diminished from murder to manslaughter. You lose control of your faculties. You lose control of your ability to reason when you feel that rage come on. And it explains a lot of the great atrocities that have happened. So the blacks live in fear of that constantly. And I didn't mean to go on this long about this, but I feel like it needs to be said once in a while. And so when you look at the prison populations and you look at the murder rates, you look at their earlier, shorter life expectancy, when you look at all the factors that have a target on the back of the black male, and then you look at how isolated white America is from the black community, and how much they're taught to fear the black community, it's why and how racism is still as powerfully a charged tool as it is still today. As long ago as slavery was, there's threads and cords and sheets of this fabric that are pushed into our faces constantly. And a lot of it, I'm just going to be honest here, a lot of it comes from an ignorant, unexposed, uncomfortable, unfamiliar white America. I didn't meet a lot of really racist black people. I'm not saying they don't exist, and I've heard there's some old black males who come from that old guard who can be pretty, but I just didn't meet them. And being a Canadian, we talked pretty openly, and they saw me playing the black music, and so they were like, how does this young white kid know all this music? And so they opened up to me, and we would talk about America and about history, and they would talk to me like I was a black guy, and they called me their nigger. You know, I mean, that happened very frequently. Like, you black. You know, I mean, you're my brother from another mother. I got called that stuff all the time. And they'd be looking at me like with one eye, be like, you half a nigger? Like, they would say that stuff to me. And it was a term of endearment. It was a term of, I trust you. And when you had that kind of welcome to our club, you actually understand who we are and what we're about. It allows us to dialogue on a different level than just some random white guy. I have crates full of their music. The Shy-Lights, the Stylistics, I got all this stuff on vinyl. I collected all this Marvin Gaye, Stevie Wonder, and Bobby Womack. And they're like, man, I grew up to those records. I used to clean my Buick to those records. 8 tracks. And so a bond was created. And we did trust and dialogue very openly. And I was surprised how often I had more animosity towards white racism than they did. They often were like, yeah, it's just how it is, man. It wasn't like they had this chance to open up and go, oh, yeah, fuck all that, I hate white. It never happened. They were much more tolerant and forgiving than you would ever imagine. And I think the average white American who lives in fear would be shocked if they could actually hear what the average black conversation sounds like. It's not nearly as much about we're going to get white America as it is about how do we keep our kids safe still today. I meant to cover a couple records here, but I see we're already at the 42-minute mark. So I'm just going to have to wrap this up right here, right now. But I think these things need to be said. Tomorrow, or the next episode, we're going to dive into a fantastic Miles Davis record and a couple other records. And I have a fun thing coming up with Savoy. I've had enough people say they want to see some more Savoy. So I got a little fun episode coming on that. It'll be about a week before I have time to put it together. I got to pull a bunch of things out. But y'all be safe. Y'all be blessed. I'll probably do at least one more episode before Christmas. We're all home in lockdown anyway, so we might as well talk about jazz and the world. But I challenge anybody who thinks that they know about what racism is about to make sure you've immersed yourself in that community before you speak. Make sure you know more than what you've seen on television. Because I can assure you that how things are shown on television is meant to keep you scared. It's meant to keep you voting a certain way. It's meant to keep both sides outraged. And social media has only exacerbated this problem. And social media has actually allowed there to be a lot of untrue, outraging stories circulate. And that's the problem, is that at least with the 6 o'clock news, the event at its core happened. How they shade it might be propaganda, but the event actually happened. With social media, there's no telling who's putting these stories together sometimes. And some of it's so outrageously, obviously false. And I can't believe how many times, too, I saw things that were such and such a white guy did this to a black guy, he's getting exonerated, there'll be no charges. And sometimes it looks so unjust that you're like, how can this be allowed? But once you realize that that's what they want you to see is the injustice to make you angry, it makes sense. Like, oh, this injustice is allowed because they want it to be that way. They want it to seem unjust. So you walk around indignant and outraged and going, this just can't be. Instead of seeing that it's a charade. It's all, and it doesn't mean people ain't really caught up in these things. People do suffer great injustices. But boy, a lot of stuff on social media is just fake. It's just fake from both sides of the camp. And it's all about keeping that fear. Because the second my Roman citizens ain't afraid of the outlying provinces and the territories beyond, conquering and stealing from those places becomes a lot more difficult. So I need to keep you scared. And in spite of that flag and those guns and those claims of freedom, we're the most scared people on the planet. We're the most scared people on the planet. And I can't think of anything less free than living in fear. I'm the Jazz Shepherd. My name is Dan. Grab some Shepherd merchandise, help support my family. These are tough economic times for me. I'm sure they are for many of you as well. But we'll get through this. I'll be back to DJing sometime in 2021. Cosmos willing. May we all be provided for. May we all have plenty of food on our table in the holidays. Be safe. Bless. Peace.